You ever have one of those moments where you're staring at $300 worth of liquid chemicals sitting in a plastic bucket and you realize you're about 10 seconds away from making a very expensive, very permanent mistake?
Is this about the walnut table in the corner that currently looks like it was attacked by a giant blueberry?
We don't talk about the blueberry incident in polite company, Alex. But yeah, that was the day I learned that deep pour isn't just a marketing term, it's a physical law. I thought I could outsmart the chemistry. I poured 4 inches of high viscosity resin into a cedar cavity in the middle of a July heat wave. About 20 minutes later, the shop started smelling like a hair salon that was on fire.
I remember that. You called me sounding like you'd just witnessed a crime.
It was a crime against lumber. The resin hit what they call exothermic peak. It got so hot, it actually started to smoke and crack. It looked like the earth's crust was dividing right there in my shop. That slab of walnut turned into a very heavy, very ugly space heater.
Well, today we are making sure nobody else turns their expensive hardwood into a radiant heating element. We're diving deep, literally, into river tables. Tiger, I want to break this down for the people who are terrified of the goop. Because let's be honest, woodworking is usually subtractive. You cut things away, resin is additive, and once it's in there, it's part of the family forever.
Exactly. It's a marriage with no possibility of divorce. So, before you even crack a seal on a jug of epoxy, we have to talk about the dam. People think the wood is the hard part. No, building a leak-proof box is the real engineering feat here.
See, this is where I'd lose my mind. You spend 50 hours sanding this gorgeous piece of live edge maple, and then you're going to trust some tuck tape and hot glue to hold back 5 gallons of liquid?
It's a leap of faith, but you have to build the cathedral before you hold the service. Most guys use melamine board because resin hates it. It won't stick. But you can't just screw it together and hope. You've got to caulk every single seam like you're building a submarine. I use 100% silicone. And here's the thing. If you think you've used enough, you're about halfway there. Then you go over every inch of that melamine with sheathing tape, that shiny red stuff.
Why the tape specifically?
Because resin is a search party. It will find a gap the size of a hair, and it will vacate your mold onto your shop floor while you're upstairs eating a sandwich. I once spent 6 hours prep Porter River, came back the next morning, and the mold was empty. My boots, however, were permanently bonded to the concrete floor.
So the floor became the table.
Very sturdy, very difficult to move.
Okay, so the mold is watertight. Let's talk about the wood itself. You can't just throw a dusty log in there and expect it to look like a professional gallery piece.
That's the quickest way to end up with a ghostly table. If you don't seal the edges of the wood, the part that's going to be touching the resin, you're inviting the bubble demon into your house. Wood is basically a bundle of straws. When that resin hits the wood, it wants to soak in, and it pushes the air out of those straws.
And those are the bubbles that get trapped as the resin hardens.
Precisely. You get this fizzing effect. It looks like your table has a carbonation problem. To stop it, you take a little bit of your resin, just a thin coat, and you paint it onto the live edge. You prime it. You let that dry, it plugs up all those microscopic straws, and then when you do the big pour, the wood stays quiet.
Does the type of wood matter? I see people using everything from rotten driftwood to kiln-dried walnut.
Moisture is the enemy. If that wood has more than 8 or 9% moisture, the resin will react with it. It'll turn cloudy, or worse, it won't cure. It'll stay tacky, like a piece of gum left on a park bench. You need kiln-dried stuff. And for the love of all that is holy, get the bark off.
Wait, why? The bark is the cool part.
No, the bark is the part that fails. Resin will stick to the bark, but the bark isn't stuck to the wood very well. 6 months later, the wood shrinks a tiny bit, the bark lets go, and your beautiful river table develops a massive crack right down the middle because the resin was holding onto a layer of dead skin. You got to strip it down to the bright wood, scrape it, wire brush it, make it clean enough to eat off of.
Looking at the state of your workbench, I don't think I'll be eating off anything in here.
Hey, that's character.
Let's get into the chemistry of the pour. This is where the real math phobia kicks in for people. 1 to 1, 2 to 1, and what happens if I'm off by a teaspoon?
If you're off by a teaspoon in a small batch, you've just made a very expensive bowl of soup that will never get hard. This isn't like cooking where a pinch of salt works. This is like rocket fuel. You have to be precise.
So use the graduated buckets?
Use the buckets, but don't trust the lines on the side of the plastic if they're cheap. I use a digital scale. Weight is more accurate than volume because resin doesn't lie to a scale. And then you stir. And you stir until your arm feels like it's going to fall off. Then you stir for another 3 minutes.
I've seen people use those drill mixers. Is that cheating?
It's not cheating, but it's dangerous. You whip it too fast and you're folding millions of air bubbles into the mix. It looks like a milkshake. You want a slow, deliberate folding motion, like you're mixing a very thick cake batter and you don't want to wake up the neighbors. If you see streaks or veins in the liquid, you aren't done. It needs to be crystal clear, like mountain water.
And the deep pour versus tabletop distinction. Can we clarify that? Because I think that's where people literally have the meltdowns you mentioned.
This is the most important part of the whole process. Tabletop resin is designed to be poured thin, maybe 1/8 of an inch. It's hot, it reacts fast. If you pour that 3 inches deep, it will literally boil. It'll turn yellow, it'll crack, and it might actually melt your plastic mold.
It's an exothermic reaction. It generates its own heat.
Exactly. Deep pour resin is slow. It's designed to sit there for 48 to 72 hours and slowly, gradually find its way to a solid state. It doesn't get hot because the reaction is spread out over days instead of minutes. If you're doing a river, you need the slow stuff. It gives the bubbles time to float to the top and escape.
It sounds like patience is the most expensive tool in your shop.
It's the one I'm most frequently out of stock on.
Let's talk about the look, the pigments. I've seen some that look like a galaxy and others that look like a puddle of oil. How do you get that movement without it looking like a third-grade science project?
It's all about the timing of the swirl. If you put your mica powder in and stir it immediately, it all just settles or blends into a flat color. If you want those cells or those wispy clouds that look like a drone shot of the ocean, you have to wait.
Wait for it to start thickening?
Yeah. You wait until the resin has the consistency of honey. That's the gel stage. If you swirl it then, the resin is thick enough to hold the shape of your stir stick's path. If you do it too early, the current just washes it away. It's a bit of a dance. You're checking it every 30 minutes, poking at it with a toothpick.
And what about the bridge? I see people clamping wood down so it doesn't float. Does wood really float in resin?
Absolutely. Wood is lighter than liquid plastic. If you don't screw it down or clamp it, your river will become a flood and your boards will just drift away to the edges of the mold. I use bridge clamps, basically just scraps of 2x4 across the top of the mold with some bolts to hold the slabs firmly against the bottom.
It sounds like a lot of prep for something that takes 5 minutes to actually pour.
You've got the ratio right there. It's 95% prep, 4% pouring, and 1% praying.
Okay, let's say the pour went perfectly. No leaks, no boiling, no bubbles. You peel it out of the mold. It looks kind of dull and weirdly shaped. Now what?
Now the sanding purgatory begins. This is where the boys are separated from the men, or rather the people with patience are separated from the people who want to throw their project into the woods.
Why is resin harder to sand than wood?
Because it's plastic. If you stay in one spot too long, the friction creates heat. The heat softens the resin, and it corns up. It gums up your sandpaper in half a second. You have to sand it wet, or you have to go very, very slow. You start at 80 grit to get it flat, and you work your way up. 120, 150, 220, 400. When you hit 1,000 grit, the resin starts to clear up. At 3,000 grit, it starts to look like glass.
And you're doing this for the wood and the resin at the same time?
That's the trick. You're balancing two different worlds. Wood wants to be sanded dry. Resin loves being sanded wet. I usually sand them both dry up to about 320. Then I switch to a hard wax oil finish like Rubio Monocoat or Odie's oil. Those finishes are magic because they bond to the wood fibers and they sit on top of the resin, giving it a nice satin glow without needing a literal mirror polish.
Do you ever miss just making a table out of wood without the chemistry set?
Every time I have to clean a spilled drop of epoxy off my favorite chisel. But then you see the light hit a piece of translucent blue resin nestled against a slab of gnarled cherry, and it looks like something that shouldn't exist. It looks like you captured a piece of a river and froze it in time. That's the payoff.
It's the wow factor.
It's the wow factor that covers up the OW factor from earlier in the week.
So, for the person sitting in their garage right now, looking at a slab and a box of resin, what's the one thing they should remember when they start pouring?
Don't chase perfection on the first gallon. Your first pour might have a bubble. It might have a little bit of dust in it. But a river table is a living thing. If you mess up, you can drill out a bubble and fill it. You can sand back a mistake. The only real failure is letting the fear of the goop keep the wood sitting in the corner of your shop.
The fear of the goop. That's going on a t-shirt.
Just don't print it in epoxy. It'll never come off.
Fair enough. Thanks for the masterclass, Tiger. I think I'm actually brave enough to try a coaster now.
Start small, Alex. The ocean was just a very big puddle that didn't leak.